All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. All right, so please continue to enjoy your breakfast as we begin what I'm sure is going to be a very insightful panel discussion here this morning. It is now my pleasure to introduce the panel moderator, Colonel Ryan Golden, who is the Deputy Director of the MILCOM Systems Directorate at SMC. Colonel Golden was commissioned through Penn State's ROTC program back in 1996, and he has since served in a variety of intelligence, satellite operations, and space acquisition positions for Air Force and joint organizations. In his current role, Colonel Golden directs acquisition planning, budgeting, and operational support for the $40 billion MILSATCOM portfolio. I'll say that again, $40 billion MILSATCOM portfolio. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Colonel Golden and our very esteemed industry executive panel.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday, and thank you all for coming. I'm sure some of you are just here for breakfast, but that's okay too. I have the privilege this morning of hosting a very distinguished panel of some senior leaders from our industry partners. So let me introduce them first, and then we'll get into it. But before I do that, let me thank AFCEA and IEEE for hosting this conference, and especially for holding it here on the West Coast. It's been fabulous this week, and I'm sure there's a lot more good to come today. So let's give them all a round of applause for this conference, please. So first, to my left, I have Ms. Kay Sears, who's the Vice President and General Manager of Military Space Programs for Lockheed Martin. Next, we have Mr. Tony Gingiss, from the CEO of OneWeb Satellites. Next, we have Mr. Jamie Morgan, Director of MILSATCOM Programs, Northrop Grumman Aerospace Systems. Next to him, we have Major General Retired Roger Teague, Vice President for Space, Intelligence, and Missile Defense, Government Operations from the Boeing Company. And down on the end, we have Mr. Ken Peterman, President of Viasat Government Systems. So thank you all for coming, and really appreciate your participation in this panel this morning.
Thanks for having us.
So we don't have a whole lot of time this morning, so we'll go ahead and get started. We've heard in several forums this week that the space domain is becoming a more contested environment, and that the U.S. and our allies need to find ways to field capabilities more quickly to keep pace with our potential adversaries. So, question to all of you, we'll just kind of go down the line. How is the space industry changing to better support the government to address the changing national security space landscape? So, Ms. Sears, would you like to start?
Sure, thanks. Thanks also to AFCEA. I'd like to express our thanks for this event. It's always great to get everybody together to talk about national security to the extent that we can. I just think it feels like a different time right now for this nation and for space. And I think we can recognize that in a few different ways. There's obviously a conversation going on about the Space Force, so that's on one end. We've got new organizations being formed to address the challenges in space. We have an increasing threat environment, and so I think there is a significant change in behavior around space. And so I think that requires a corresponding change in behavior of all of us. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think there is a time-critical nature to what we're talking about here. I don't think ever in our history have we been faced with such a sense of urgency to respond with new capability in space. And so it's a little bit of a perfect storm, because there are capabilities, new capabilities, highly developmental capabilities, one-time things that we have never done before in space, and we have to deliver those capabilities as fast as possible. So the idea that we can do this in a vacuum is crazy. We have to partner like we've never done before. We have to work with our SMC brethren to tackle this feat. We have to partner as industry. We have to funnel our investment in the right places, or else I think we will not deliver the capability that's needed in time. So I think there is just a significant call to arms here related to space. We've had it in other domains. This is the first time we've had it in space, and we need to step up and meet the challenge.
Mr. Gingas, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Kay. I think really good points. If you think about where we are, I really think of the era that we're in as a new space race. And I don't mean it as a political space race, although there is an element of that to it, but it really is about kind of a cooperative run and race for things to get into space. And I think we're seeing it across both government and commercial. And I think we're seeing large investments from the commercial sector. Someone gave me the analogy that, you know, some of the billionaire investments today are the Rockefellers and some of the traditional people that we know, the investors in our country historically, but they're the ones of the 21st century investing. But that doesn't mean that it's going to lean all the way to commercial. I think there's a balance that's forming. I think we are seeing a change in the fundamental time constant and dollar to get to space. We're seeing things being developed on cycle times that are radically different than all of us have experienced living in the industry and growing up in it. I think we're seeing the amount of dollars invested is actually increasing, but I think the value we're getting for those dollars are really becoming better and better. We're getting a lot more for the money. But what I think is really, what is really changing is that there's a little bit of both the risk, the contested element of space that I think it's been made very clear to all of us that we have to be essentially on guard. Space is now a contested environment. I think many of us have thought that for a long time, but I think it's kind of an acknowledged item, but it's also a pioneering aspect. People are going there like people went out west hundreds of years ago, 100 years ago. So I think we're seeing both government and industry driving to space, trying to bring the economics of space down, trying to bring essentially more tools in the tool belt. Kay and I were having a good discussion just before this, and I said, I think what you're seeing that's a little different is a lot of people express some of these decisions as or decisions. We can do this or that. We can have government investment or commercial investment. We can do it the government way or we can do it the commercial way. And I always say we should think about an and mentality, because it's not one thing or the other. Just like when you build a fleet, there are all kinds of ships, planes, combatants, whatever. It's a mix of all kinds of different skill sets. I think we have to look at how do we take the best of what has been done in the government and the military and in that realm and what's being done in commercial, and how do we bring them together and create an and so that we can get the best, because we have to be able to respond not only to keep our commercial economy going, but to keep the safety of our country. And I think that is really the ecosystem I see developing across the industry. So I really agree with Kay. I think we're at, I think of it as a new space race, but it is a turning point. I think we will not recognize the space industry in 10 years, and I think that's a really good thing. It'll be a good not recognizing it.
Okay, thank you, sir. Mr. Morgan?
Yeah, I'd have to echo all those comments and emphasize a few things. First of all, space is a warfighting domain, and that's because of the threats. We can't overstate that. We can't overemphasize that, and that's driving significant change to the total landscape of national security space. And we've heard that expressed this week by General Thompson, Colonel McKenzie, every speaker that's gotten up. So that is a call to arms. I agree with Kate's point on that. And in recent years, because of that, we've seen and heard about the growing threats. We've seen the emergence of resilient architectures and requirements driven by resiliency. Because this is MILCOM, let's talk about MILSATCOM. We've seen the AOA converge. We thought that was going to go on forever, but that converged. And now we've got firm direction, and that's allowing SMC to move out on 4 major acquisitions to move from today's architecture to a more resilient next generation MILSATCOM architecture. It allows industry to prepare and go out and compete for those. We're seeing 804 rapid prototype acquisitions. Solutions are evolving, so the whole landscape is changing. And that presents a lot of challenges to both the government and industry, obviously. I love the SMC 2.0 desired outcomes. As clear as a lot of thought's been going into that, and gives me a lot of hope that we're going in the right direction. Easier said than done to execute, but that's certainly a transformation from our perspective and a challenge. And we're both challenged to figure out how to get from today's single layer, less resilient than it needs to be, large satellite kind of a system, to this multi-layer, integrated combat cloud kind of a vision that we got, which is where we need to be more resilient. And challenges on both sides. The government has to figure out the optimal way to acquire, deliver, and launch all that stuff. And industry, and let me speak for my perspective at Northrop Grumman as a traditional, defense space contractor, we need to reform and refine our processes. Our culture is driven by more than not, large, exquisite, high-performing, very high reliability satellites. We got to retain most of that, but we also have to refine and refirm to do things a lot faster and to look at smaller augmentation satellites. So we're doing a lot of that at Northrop Grumman. We've increased the focus on resilience architectures. We're doing rapid prototyping as integral to our space business. We're continuing the core commitment to mission understanding to optimize architectures, which is important. Even with rapid prototyping, we got to be sure to still deliver Class A-like mission assurance for missions like Next-Gen OPIR and certainly strategic comms. And we're preparing more for both the large sats and the small sats, and we see mixed constellations out there. And in fact, we're, as a good example, to go along with our large sats, which we typically evolve satellite to satellite in our core business, which we need to do more of in defense space. An example of a small sat program is a OSD DARPA program, prototype demonstration, ESPASat, 173 kilograms, launched on a $5 million rocket, $20 million program in 18 months to fly something and provide real operational capability. So that's representative, I'm sure, of some of the things we're all doing, but we're broadening that trade space to look ahead to try to implement this cloud architecture. So a lot of changes at Northrop Grumman to support this new vision and to change our culture to best execute it.
Okay, General Teague.
Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be with you all here this morning. And first, thanks to Scott Gustafson, my good friend and SBIR's running mate for many years, doing great things now with Lockheed. But Scott, thanks for organizing this panel and this topic. It's very, very important to our collective security and our collective focus on this important enterprise. Ryan, thank you for your leadership and moderating this panel, and to my industry teammates here. It's wonderful to be able to talk about some of these important issues and a great perspective across this panel with regard to, I think, what you're hearing and what you'll hear me reinforce. I certainly agree with all the points that have been previously made, but I think this is an important time in our nation's history that we collectively focus and come together and rally around Air Force Space Command, Space and Missile Systems Center, the leadership there in terms of understanding what our space enterprise vision, what the space operations construct is really asking us all to collectively do, and to bring forward in a very rapid manner those solutions and capabilities to help us deal with this rising threat environment. There's plenty of room, there's plenty of opportunity across industry, and there's plenty of solutions across industry to be able to do so. To be able to preserve our great capabilities and certainly the space capabilities that we all know and depend upon every day. But I think in order to be able to continue to lead the world and be able to defend our great country, we need to focus first and foremost on our government industry partnerships. The folks in this room here right now, this is an important time. These are important conversations to be had. And we need to be able to leverage the dynamic that goes on here and put it into actionable plans and be able to deliver products rapidly and not study them to death. We were talking a little bit before with regard to the amount of time it takes for analysis of alternatives to be complete through our bureaucratic processes. And it just eats up all kinds of time. It's part of the process, we understand, but there are ways that collectively we can partner to help reduce those times and start getting on about the business of fielding capability that we so desperately need. As you look, I applaud, as Jamie said, I applaud the initiatives that are going on at SMC and the SMC 2.0 intent to reorganize and hopefully field capability. There's certainly a much more intense focus on fielding capability rapidly, which is an important part of what obviously we're trying to do here. You do that in a backdrop where, looking forward, I don't know that our budgets are going to be rising too much anymore in the future. And so that creates a real challenge and a real problem for us in terms of, all right, well, where's the money going to come from? And it requires us all collectively to be more efficient and to find those opportunities and, frankly, those strengths within each of our companies, within each of our portfolios, to not only leverage our strengths and find our own niche that we can contribute to the broader capabilities in the broader portfolio and the overall strength of the enterprise. Again, I just know that the momentum, the will, the intent is there. It's just a matter of going forward and executing it now. I would say, as part of that, I'm encouraged by the continued focus on tech maturation and rapid prototyping. I think that's been an important part and a key piece of being able to demonstrate those technologies and whatever capabilities in whatever mission area we're trying to do, mature it, but then get on with fielding systems. That's the piece where we've fallen short, I believe, over the years, is that we haven't seen the follow-through because of other competing budget priorities, and you never get to that next generation or iteration of capability. And I think that's a very, very important part of critical next steps that are going to be needed to be successful. I would also encourage emphasis on our international partnerships. It's important that we leverage our friends from around the world, those who are supportive of the same cause of freedom that we are. We are doing so certainly in programs like WGS. When and wherever possible, we ought to continue to do that. We can talk more about that if there's room or time here on the panel. And then as well, I reinforce the notion that commercial systems and capabilities, certainly Boeing is right in the heart of that, have a role to play. And it's important that while commercial, DoD is not going to cut all of its systems over to commercial capabilities, there is room for augmentation, there is room for supplementation, and there's an important role as you look to build resilient architectures. I believe it's important to be able to tap into those commercial capabilities and further enhance our overall systems. So again, Ryan, thanks very much for this opportunity to join you all, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Mr. Peterman.
Thank you, Ryan. I've been in this business for 40 years and came out of school a long time ago and working on UHF DAMA SATCOM before there was DAMA. And so I listened to the comments on this panel and I agree with an awful lot of them. I liked the way Kay characterized it in terms of a perfect storm, and I also want to spend a minute on the point Roger made on the time it takes for DoD to act and implement an AOA or do an acquisition process. So let me characterize it this way. I think that when I came out of school, technology leadership was in DoD in these important sectors of mobile networking, satellite communications, and cybersecurity. And sometime in the last 10 or 15 years, that technology leadership crossed over to the private sector. And I think today, the private sector, certainly in satellite communications, is the technology leader in this area. So there's a significant and yet untapped opportunity for DoD to capture what I'll call the technology dividend. We all know about the peace dividend, the technology dividend of not having to be the inventor of this technology anymore. I mean, IDA and DIAX have issued studies that talk about the length of time it takes for DoD acquisition process to work. And I think it takes a long time because in large part it's predicated on a process of inventing technology. And it needs to transition to take advantage of this yet untapped opportunity. It needs to transition to applying this commercial technology that is readily available and is on this enormously steep trajectory of getting better and better. To use an analogy, mobile networking goes from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G LTE in a matter of a decade or so. In the time it takes DoD to implement an AOA, we probably go through at least one technology generation in terms of satellite communication in the private sector. If you look at the studies IDA and DIACS have done, they talk about the fact that even if everything goes right in a DoD acquisition process, it takes 8 to 14 years to go from validated requirement to first unit equipped. Now that's not IOC, and that's certainly not FOC, that's first unit equipped. In that 8 to 14 years, what are we talking about, 3 or 4 generations of technology? So I think getting back to Kay's point on perfect storm, now we have the intersection of this technology crossover that presents a yet untapped opportunity. We have an opportunity to bring technology to the warfighter faster than ever before, more affordably than ever before, and it's more compelling and urgent that we do this now than ever because of the peer threat that's emerging that is so significant. We were at AUSA a couple weeks ago. We demonstrated a 60-centimeter satellite dish, okay? And we're pulling down 140 megabits per second, and the important thing, I mean, that's like 6 high-def video channels simultaneously. And the thing that's important about it is not just the capacity. The thing that's important, and this was demonstrated in the recent Army Saber Strike exercise where the 82nd jumped out of an airplane with this thing strapped to their chest. It's that small. But it's not just the capacity, it's that this satellite communications was fully protected. It's effectively immune to ground-based jamming. It's effectively immune to data collection at the distributed ground architecture. It's effectively increasingly immune to kinetic strike of the ground architecture because the ground architecture is so distributed and hides in plain sight. It's just satellite dishes about the same size. So this is not just about the technology leadership in the private sector, but it's about the technology leadership that is directly applicable to this DoD protected space environment. And I think there's an enormously untapped opportunity here where we can bring this technology to these young men and women in uniform much faster than ever before. And an example of the pace of play, we serve about 2 million devices on our hybrid adaptive network every day. Hundreds of aircraft, thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of ground users, and we have a real-time management system that knows the device performance in real time of every device on our network. And in fact, the pace of play is substantial. I think we're outfitting about 100 commercial airline aircraft per month, which statistically is about 3 a day. So the ability to transition and take advantage of this technology is here and now and available. We just need to figure out collectively and collaboratively how to do it.
That's a great point, and I appreciate that. And so we've heard several of our panelists here today talk about the ability to update our technology more quickly. And we obviously have a challenge, with fielding terminals out to the field, and then the timeline for the government to field those out there and take advantage of the system is really a big driver in those timelines. How can we better architect our systems to take advantage and incorporate those technology refresh cycles? And how do we build some common standards that allow us to do things like roam across networks? And what can we do to affect that? And I'll open up the panel for anybody who'd like to start.
Well, I'll start. I feel like we're doing this all wrong, right? We do these huge block upgrades of everything at the same time. It's crazy. So, I mean, we got to think about it differently. We're setting ourselves up, we were just talking, we're setting ourselves up to do it again in 2030. Every system is going to be a next generation system in 2030. We don't have the people, we don't have the resources, we don't have the funding to work like that. These things have to be thought of differently. And we need continuous investment in the payload side of this technology innovation. On the platform side, you don't have to really focus on that as much from an innovation perspective because it doesn't need to change as much. But we're trying to do these huge block upgrades of everything, platforms and payloads and resiliency capability all at once. So we need a steady stream of investment coming out of the government on the payload side, on the resiliency side. On the platform side, we go in blocks. I mean, we need to pull a page out of the NRO and look at what they're doing, because they do continuous investment. And what happens when we don't do that is both industry and government realize, oh my gosh, we're way behind. We got to go spend huge NRE money now to get caught up into the next generation. And industry is left to figure out, well, what should we be investing in with the IRAD dollars that we have? So we're missing the architecture piece, which would guide industry in that investment that they can make, and we're missing this idea that we can't upgrade everything all at once. So we got to get on a different path. That is what I see.
Yeah, and to add to what Kay's saying, I think, Ken brought it up. There's this idea that we're creating technology. We're doing these large block upgrades. We're in this mode of creating what we're going to deploy. I think we need to really drive towards a mode where we're industrializing, we're producing, and we're deploying technology. The technology exists. We don't have to go invent it. It's out there. It's in the commercial realm. Now, there are cases where we do have to take it and do unique things for certain military applications, but we are not agile at taking the technology that's out there, getting it into product, getting it into the field, and we can't be on 10 or 15-year cycles. We have to be on 24 or 36-month cycles. That's what the tech industry is on. That's what the commercial realm is on. If we don't get on that, we are falling on the military side farther and farther behind, and the costs, everyone's seen the curves, they exponentially grow, and it's everyone wants to do these large upgrades. Now, I say that, but I think there's a lot of people who know that we have to do it differently, and they know we have to do that. We have to figure out how to do essentially what many in the software and other industries have done, spiral development, iterative. We have to be willing to take risk, manage risk, get things out there, industrialize them, get the cost down, get the deployment time down, get them out there quickly so that we can actually keep the technology refreshed, and then focus on the areas where we really need to add things that maybe aren't available in the commercial world or where the technologies don't exist. But I'll push back a little on, we don't need to develop standards. We need to go implement standards. The standards are there. And I think we just have to decide that we want to be on that pace. And again, it doesn't mean that everything has to be on that pace, but you have to have that quick, agile, bringing technology to the forefront and be able to do that. And yes, in the background, there will be the longer arc where we're making longer investments because there really is a fundamental technology. But it's like we don't have a balanced portfolio now. Any business that had a portfolio that rolled out a product every 10 years would die.
I think Tony and Kay are right, and I think that I agree with taking a page out of the NRO playbook, and I think we ought to, and I think Tony's right, that we need to be very careful about interface standards and what level we place those standard interfaces at. Let's also take a lesson from the Jitters playbook, a program that spent $10 billion over a decade and didn't really field anything. And I think what happened is we tried to implement interface standards at way too low a level, the modem level and some of that stuff. And I think that if you take a look at what we're doing, just with Viasat, since 2002, we've operated a global satellite network, what we call a hybrid adaptive network that has 30 to 40 satellites and different networks in play so that folks like Air Force One and the Blue and White Fleet can roam among these different satellites. They're in different frequency bands, KU, KA, high capacity KA, MILCOM. They're in different orbital regimes, GEO as well as MEO. They utilize different ground infrastructure. They utilize different waveforms, but because the interface is open at the network layer, we're able to roll whole satellite networks on and off our network. We review our network every 30 days, and we roll off networks that are no longer competitive, no longer have sufficient capacity, no longer can provide the quality of service that we're committing to our customers. And we roll on new networks because the interface is at the network layer, just like when your cell phone roams from GSM to CDMA when you travel around the world. So I think that we need to take a lesson from NRO, we need to take a lesson from Jitters, we need to take a lesson from what Tony said and make sure we implement an open standard interface at the network layer so we incentivize competition, we don't constrain innovation. The next generation satellite system that we roll onto our Viasat Han could be at V-band, and we can embrace that, okay, because we're not setting the interface standard too low.
I would just add the caution, and there's certainly been focus on it, but it's got to continue to remain first and foremost, is not to continue to resist the temptation of chasing edge of the envelope requirement sets. We get ourselves in that pickle many, many times because we feel like that, hey, I won't be able to launch, or I won't be able to field a new system or a new block upgrade for a significant period of time, so therefore I need to get that 98th percentile requirement set incorporated in my basic design. And as the panelists have pointed out, I mean, the technology is there today and their opportunities are there, and to be able to refresh and relook at the way our architectures are built and how often that they are replenished is a different calculus today than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. The cost of assured access to space has been reduced dramatically. And so with that brings new opportunities and new ways of looking at our architectures and our replenishments.
Yeah, let me just simply add, just to add to Kay's comments, there is some existence proof that we can change quicker within our traditional process. We've got a core mission area at Northrop Grumman, like I said before, where, you know, production line bus, multiple spacecraft, no space vehicle, though, has the same payload capability as the last. We're always inserting new capabilities to keep up with the threat and mission need. And the enablers for that is spacecraft design, flexible AI&T process, and more importantly is just the customer culture and collaboration that would allow that kind of risk-taking even late in the SVI&T process. And as a recent example of that, one of our more recent spacecraft, we went from user need to concept in about 6 weeks. We had hardware tested and delivered after the customer said go. We had hardware tested and delivered in 18 months, and that delivered this new capability pretty late in the Space V AI&T process. Integrated within months of delivery, and finding a way to do that without really at all disrupting the space vehicle baseline cost and schedule. So it can be done even within a traditional process if you're smart about it and you've got the right kind of customer collaboration and willingness to take a little risk.
Can I add?
Absolutely, yeah,
I'm
please.
going to be a little challenging here. So this is the National Security Space Panel, right? It's not the Tactical Comms Panel. So I disagree that all of this technology exists. I think that we are doing things, at least I'm seeing, requirements for space security that we have never seen before. And it's a layered defense type of strategy. It's got to be a layered architecture, and there are definitely areas where commercial technology has a role. The most important thing that we can do as an industry is figure out where to leverage commercial, but an equally important decision is to figure out where we cannot. There is a level of national security space that is completely new. You know, the requirement to defend our assets in space. This does not exist commercially. Commercials never had the requirement to defend their assets in space. So I would just challenge us to think about the right places to apply commercial capability. Some of the things Ken and Tony have mentioned, absolutely. But we have also we have to recognize that these are times that we are doing things and challenging ourselves to do things in space that have not been done before, and especially have not been done commercially.
And I think
I respect that point. That being said, we don't put our commercial technology on the front page of the IEEE Journal for everyone to see. I mean, the secret recipe to Coca-Cola is in the vault somewhere, and it's this commercial technology. The right way for us to assess objectively and quantitatively this commercial technology against the current requirements, these emergent requirements, these defense requirements that Kay's alluding to, is to quantitatively, empirically measure the performance of these systems against those emergent threat envelopes in a warfighter context, in a contested environment with EW and cyber, and let's measure the performance and give these commercial systems a report card, classified if need be, so that the commercial industry can see how they perform against these requirements, and so can the customer. Now that means if the warfighter needs to roam onto these commercial networks in a bad day, they know exactly how it's going to perform in that warfighter context, in that protected environment. It's been empirically and quantitatively measured. And the second thing that will happen is industry will be incentivized to address the weaknesses in their design and address these requirements using their own money on their own agile development processes and raise the bar of these commercial capabilities on a timeline that's going to be unprecedented in terms of what this industry's typically seen. Why not do that?
I agree. I think your point about an analytical approach to this is absolutely an imperative. And we're not, it's hard work. Creating the analysis on a resiliency score or resiliency factor, that's hard work. And I think in the space enterprise vision, you know, we're not at that analytical level yet. You know, they haven't defined it to the level that we can actually measure resiliency. And we have to get there. To Ken's point, and even with our own systems, we have to put them through that same rigor to know where to focus and to know where to invest in this layered defense.
And I think for all those reasons, exactly what you two were just saying, we have to be able to look at what are the things that we're doing that we can leverage, exactly as you said, and where can we do that, because there's finite dollars, there's finite resources, there's finite time, and we want to focus on the areas where we really do have to develop something new, something exquisite, and yet the way we can actually save some of that time and money is to leverage the other things that are already out there. So it really is, again, it's an and, it's not an or. How do we do that analysis to figure out where the right investments really make sense and really move the ball forward from a security point of view?
Yeah, so it sounds like, you know, some of the things you're talking about as far as the new technologies, you know, prototyping is one of our SMC 2.0 key tenets of how we move forward with some of this. And as we go forward, you know, accepting risk is another thing that we've been saying that is, you know, right now the SMC culture is not really geared to accept a lot of risk, but we're trying to move in that direction. So as we go forward, how do we, where are the smart places we can accept more acquisition or even possibly mission risk? And what are the potential pitfalls of trying to go too fast in those rooms?
If I can jump in, I'll talk about, I think one of the reasons why it's hard for people to, and it's hard for our industry to accept risk is because think about the stakes. I mean, think about anyone in this room, would you accept risk on, oh, you're gonna buy a $500,000 house, or in Los Angeles, $1 million house, and it could fall down tomorrow, that's a risk. Would you take that risk? No. You're gonna drive a car, the wheel may fall off, would you take that risk? No. Your life's at stake. It's a big, expensive thing. You're going to buy a pack of gum. You want to try it out. Not sure you'll like it. You're going to take that risk? Absolutely. If you don't like it, you'll throw it away. And I really am putting those bookends there as an example, and I'm not saying that we're creating disposable technology, but when you are talking about things that take 10 or 15 years to build, that cost billions of dollars, that if they don't work, lives are on the line and there's no alternative, that's hard to convince people to take a risk. So I think we have to diversify the portfolio. I like the idea of prototyping, but I think we actually have to really drive the technology into the field, not as a prototype, but deploying capability. And Kay used the term, it's a multi-layered approach. We need all of those so that where we are not spending billions of dollars, but where we're incrementally bringing technology, new capabilities in, that maybe we only spend tens of millions of dollars or millions of dollars, and maybe we don't have one or two, we have hundreds or thousands. And if I had a $2 million asset that was deploying 20 of them and bringing some new technology that was a little cutting edge, would I be willing to take a risk on a 30 or 40 or $50 million investment that could bring new capability? Absolutely. Now that may lead to then something follow-on where we want to invest more money, but you can't take risk when everything is a life and death decision or has a $1 billion mark behind it, or 10 years of someone's life goes down the drain.
But let's look at the risk. Let's look at the risk objectively across the spectrum. Is the risk greater when a commercial provider has an entire satellite ecosystem and can offer a assured quality of service in terms of forward and return link, an integrated active cyber defense, an anti-jam capability, a resistance to collection at the ground stations and kinetic threat at the ground stations? That system is up there, it's operating, it's working. That risk you can quantify. You can run pilots and demonstrations, you can jam the system, do cyber penetration testing against the system, you can do all of these things and quantitatively measure and assess the risk of that system so that it is a known element. Is the risk greater there? Now, it may not solve all the corner cases, but at least you have clarity on what it does solve and what it doesn't do. Okay? Is the risk greater there? Is the risk greater when you launch a 15-year development program for multiple $1 billion where you don't, and the technology is changing every 24 months? How does that development program keep up? So I don't understand. I mean, to me, the risk is less when you buy a service where a contractor is prepared to commit to a certain quality of service in benign and contested environments, or they don't get paid. okay? To me, the risk is less there. Why not ride that technology trajectory that exists rather than try to compete with the private sector? Instead, the DoD should be focused on the corner cases where the commercial sector is not addressing them.
I just would reemphasize, I think the discussion underscores the point that ultimately, whether it's multi-layer or it's hybrid, there is investment needed in both core systems as well as your cutting-edge, commercial-like kind of capabilities. As I said in my previous remarks, I think there's room for both. There's a need for both. We need to figure out what that business model looks like in terms of sustaining both and what those contributions are. How do I measure those individual resilient capabilities that whatever commercial can bring to the table as part of that? But your core DoD missions need to be executed with DoD systems. The warfighting capabilities that with this rapidly rising and changing threat environment need to be addressed with core DoD systems that are operated by and through the warfighter. Beyond that, there are additional capabilities that ultimately can be brought to the table to help enhance that, but it really emphasizes the need to have that broader vision and look at both.
Let me address that at more of an individual level. My first job in this business was as a second lieutenant out here at Space Division, across the street from SMC, now a bunch of condos, but which later became SMC, and I was in the space electronics business in MILCOM. And I remember awarding 2 contracts for an advanced phased array antenna, and 6 months into one development was going fantastic, and the other one was going nowhere. And even if it succeeded, it wasn't as insertable as the other one. So as a lieutenant, I decided to cancel one and double down on the other one. And I got chastised for that by some colonel. That was a failure because we awarded a contract and we had to cancel it. So to me, that is not a culture of risk-taking and doing the right thing. So I think it is about the culture. Fast forward to a few years ago, we were doing everything we can to convince the customer to do something different than they were used to, and trying to convince them that ultimately it would be lower risk and have a lot of inherent advantages, but there was no way that customer was going to go for it just because it was different than what they've been doing for 20 years. That was not a culture of doing something new and taking a little risk, and it was more about, we even had a customer tell us, I don't want low and acceptable risk, I want no risk. So I think this SMC 2.0, with changing the culture to accept some more risk and do prototyping, is really going in the right direction, and that's what we need, and it starts with that changing culture. And I'm already seeing a different attitude, a different approach from Colonel McKenzie's PTS crew, which I think is really good.
I think there's a few pitfalls when we talk about prototyping. I also commend SMC on the 2.0. I think they definitely are on the right track, but some of the pitfalls that I see so far with the prototyping philosophy is that even with prototyping, you have to have an objective, either for that mission area or for the overall defense in-depth architecture. We don't have the architecture, so we're going to do it again. We're going to go start investing, even in prototypes, without understanding the end game of what we're trying to get to. And I think that is a huge mistake. We could end up throwing a lot of good money after bad without the bigger picture. The other prototyping pitfall I see already is that we are doing these sequentially. So we're going to go invest in prototypes, and then we're going to talk about the platform. Well, let's not forget our System Engineering 101. You got to design a system from end to end, and you have to do that from the very beginning. So I think we're missing an element there of running these things sequentially, which is when you add that together, you've got another 8 to 10 year program before you get operational capability. So if we're talking about prototyping so that we can go faster, we have to run these things in parallel, and we have to break that chain of a sequential, let's go invest in prototypes, and then let's go figure out how we're going to integrate them onto platforms. That has to be thought of ahead of time.
Yeah, I agree. Good points. And on the prototyping, go fast is good, get stuff up and demonstrate it good, but we can't do that till 2028, 2030 before we get some operational capability. So I would think, and I think this is the intent for PTS, I believe, is when we put prototypes up to have some sort of a vision for it and to have some residual operational capability
Right.
in the nearer term.
That was my last point. I think there's going to be pressure on us to use these prototypes operationally. We found ourselves in the same situation in the Gulf War. We had to deploy technology that was very much not intended to be operational, and we said we need it for the warfighter. So we need to be very careful about when we define prototype, we should have an eye towards using that operationally, because I think we'll be in a situation where we have to.
Yeah, and I think, Kay, that point about it can't be a prototype off to the side. It has to be something that you can bring into the operational system, plug in. We have to have a layered modular architecture to be able to plug those things in. And yes, if it's a prototype, there's a risk that it may not achieve exactly what you wanted. But if it does, then you need to be able to leverage that and operationalize it. Because that's why I guess I resist the term prototyping a little, because there's a connotation that it never goes into operation. It's just a proof of concept, and it's like, but if it works, get it out there and use it.
And I mentioned this 20 million flight demonstration we're doing. That actually is going to have a downlink that connects with an operational ground system. So we are going to get some operational capability even out of that 18-month, $20 million type of demonstration.
Well, I think there's an opportunity to aggregate together government purpose-built solutions, whole satellite networks, along with commercial networks, because in the aggregate, that provides the warfighter customer the ability to roam among all of these capabilities and leverage this yet untapped opportunity of this commercial SATCOM networks that are coming online that have such protected capabilities, have such enormous protected capabilities. And the beauty of this hybrid adaptive network of networks is that it's a non-escalatory deterrence, because it's one thing for an adversary on that bad day to kinetically strike military-specific satellites, military-specific ground infrastructure that's on military bases. Those are military targets. It's a totally different matter for an adversary to consider attacking constellations of commercial satellites, of which only maybe 1% of the traffic is military traffic, and maybe on some days there's not any, because it moves between those. The military users have the flexibility to roam among those different networks. There is a non-escalatory deterrence factors of this hybrid adaptive network architecture that we shouldn't understate.
So I'd like to take an opportunity to see if there's any questions from the audience. So Heather, do we have any?
Yes, sir. Please address the user terminal segment, which has a majority of the cost for the military.
Open to the panel. How do we better build a flexible terminal that can potentially roam across networks or whatever, and at a price point that we can afford to field it across the enterprise in a timely manner?
Well, I can speak to that from a commercial perspective, because this hybrid adaptive network, this global network that we have had in operation since 2002, has a variety of different waveforms and frequency bands and networking protocols and cybersecurity approaches and those kinds of things. And so the terminals that we provide and that other terminal providers provide that operate on this network have the ability to do that. And when we roll from, say, a waveform that Viasat-1 operated on to a waveform that Viasat-2 operated on, we routinely we upgrade 15 to 20,000 ground terminals per month in terms of that upgrade, and we do the same thing with aircraft, with software mods to modems and things like that on commercial airline fleets that we can do really rapidly and really affordably. I think this, if you think of how the commercial market's gone from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G LTE in such a short amount of time, they don't place the burden of that cost on the user. We don't pay to go from 2G to 4G to 5G LTE. The network gets rolled and it's all buried into our service costs. So when you start to look at acquiring this capability as an integrated service package, you can ride that trajectory much more affordably. We saw this with the blue and white fleet. We served the blue and white fleet for the Air Force, and capability to the aircraft went up by 4 orders of magnitude in terms of devices, speed, capacity, number of aircraft, and cost went down by a factor of 10. compared to the system they were on. And that performance has gotten better since the first day of that contract, every week, every month, in terms of cyber defense capacity, use cases, number of television channels, ability to video teleconference between aircraft, and all that capability. So I think there is like I say, there's an opportunity to ride this trajectory, and the terminal part of the problem has historically been a huge problem for the military, but in the commercial and private sector, we have figured out ways to deal with that without imposing that cost on the customer.
I would just add, the wideband AOA that's wrapping up now contemplated a terminal access cost for access to LEO, GEO, and MEO systems, a bill upwards of $38 billion to do that. Clearly, that's unaffordable. That was done through the AOA process, but it underscores the need to have, if you will, reprogrammable and cyber-hardened systems that that are not proprietary, that are open, that allows common access across a multitude of different users and flexibility to address any number of different bands. And it is the core issue, I believe, certainly within the Department of Defense, for ultimately what our future comm system architectures look like.
Yeah, I don't have the answer, but I think the two complexities that we have with the terminal segment is, number one, the military, just the sheer number of terminals don't drive the market, unlike Ken's market, where it's literally thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, millions of users. So you drive the market. When you move into military frequencies and you look at the actual number of deployed terminals, it doesn't encourage investment. So that's one issue. The second, and back to the jitters example, I mean, we try to throw all the capability into a single terminal. It's got to, work every frequency and make waffles at the same time, and it's crazy. So we have to simplify that. I truly believe, back to the architecture, if we have an overall architecture and we know what the terminal segment has to do, we can start early and we can ensure that those terminals are there, but we can't throw every requirement into a single terminal and bet the farm on one terminal.
I also think we need to dissect that $17,038 billion terminal problem into the really hard corner cases that are embedded in a B-1 or a B-2 bomber or something like that, and the majority, the 80% of that terminal problem is
Right.
things like Army ground terminals that can be swapped out
right.
really easily. So why don't we address that first and deal with the corner cases as the tough part of the problem?
Agree.
That was our final question.